Hello everyone and welcome back to the Intro Algebra video lecture series. Today we are going to be covering adding and subtracting signed numbers, which is adding and subtracting positive and negative numbers. And we're going to start with adding and subtracting whole integers, and then we are going to be moving into adding and subtracting signed rational numbers, which means adding and subtracting positives and negative fractions. So starting off with adding and subtracting integers, which is positive and negative whole numbers, there are a couple different ways that we can do this. One method of adding signed numbers is to use a number line. And you might remember from the last video that on the number line, positive numbers are to the right of 0, negative numbers are to the left of 0. And as you move further and further to the right on the number line, the numbers get larger, and vice versa. As you move left on the number line, the numbers get smaller. So positive would indicate a movement right on the number line, and negative would indicate a movement left on the number line. So you can actually use a number line to add and subtract whole numbers. So for example, we're going to take the number -1 and we're going to add to it the number -2. Now I am telling you that -1 plus -2 is equal to -3, and we're going to use a number line to show why. So if you start here at -1 and you are adding to it -2, well, negative is a movement left on the number line, so I'm going to move left 2 spaces, and I have landed on -3, so the answer is -3. Now this is one method for adding signed numbers, which does work. The issue with the number line is it really works best with whole numbers, really only works with whole numbers, and it works best with smaller whole numbers. So there are going to be a bunch of rules and shortcuts for adding and subtracting signed numbers, which we're going to get to in a few slides. But for now, we're going to use this visual representation, and I never have any issue with you using a visual representation to add or subtract signed numbers, although you will eventually be using the rules, and you should eventually get to the point where you can just add and subtract signed numbers without a number line. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to show you how to use a number line to add each of these signed numbers. And for this entire section here, we are not going to be using a calculator. So this and the next video are going to be the really only 2 times that you are not going to be allowed a calculator in this class. So we're going to take the number -1 and then we are going to add to it +2. So I'm just going to make a quick number line, and I'm going to start here at -1. Now we are adding a positive. Positive is a movement right on the number line, so I'm going to move to the right 2 spaces. I have landed on +1, so the answer is equal to +1. So then for this next one, if we're taking the number -3 and we are adding to it the number -2, just drawing a quick number line. So if we are starting here at -3 and we are going to add to it -2, well, negative is a movement left on the number line, so I am going to move to the left 2 spaces. So I have landed on -5, so the answer is equal to -5. And then for this next one, we're going to do the same thing. Now, when you are adding, you should just add as you see them from left to right. So let me just draw another quick number line here. And we're going to start here at +3. Then we're going to add to it -1, which means we will move to the left 1. And then we are adding to it a +2. So then we're going to go from here and we're going to add another 2, so we're going to go to the right 2 spaces. I have landed on +4, so the answer is equal to +4. Now, while using a number line does work for adding signed numbers, as you can see, it does get a little cumbersome. It's annoying to make a number line each time, and you can imagine that if we were dealing with larger numbers, using a number line is not really practical. So we are going to get into the rules for adding and subtracting signed numbers. Now, we already talked about opposites in the last video. Opposites are 2 numbers that are on opposite sides of 0 but are the same distance from 0, such as 1 and -1 or 2 and -2. Opposites always add up to 0. We said that in the last video, and I'm going to use a number line to show you why. So if you were to take 2 plus -2, well, if you were going to start here at 2 and move to the left 2 to add a negative 2, you would end up at 0. And since order doesn't matter with addition, you could take negative 2 plus 2 and still come out to 0. So if you take negative 2 and then add 2, meaning move 2 to the right, you end up at 0. So that is just a visual demonstration of why opposites always add up to 0. Now, for the rules for adding any other signed numbers besides opposites, they're going to follow these rules. Now, if you take a positive number and you add to it another positive number, it's kind of obvious, the answer is going to be a positive number. But you might have noticed when we added two negatives together over here, when we did negative 3 plus negative 2, we got negative 5. So a negative plus a negative is a negative, and you just add them together. So a negative plus a negative is just you add them together, and the answer is negative. Now, when you are adding a positive number to a negative number, whether the answer comes out positive or negative depends on which one of them is further away from 0. So when you're adding together a positive number plus a negative number, or vice versa, or a negative number plus a positive, the rule is that you're going to subtract them as if they were both positive. Then the final answer is going to take the sign of the number that is further away from 0. So what we're going to do is we are going to add each of these without a calculator. Now, one quick note on scientific calculators. Most scientific calculators have a negative button that is different than the subtraction button. And if you use the wrong button, one or two things is going to happen. You're either going to get an error message or you're going to get the wrong answer. So where the negative button is on a scientific calculator does vary depending on the scientific calculator. A lot of them are usually near the bottom, near the decimal point, but just find the negative button that's not the subtraction button. And if you need help, just email me with a picture of your calculator and I'll help you find it. But anyway, we're going to add each of these without a calculator. So if we're going to take negative 5 plus negative 6. So a negative plus a negative, we're just going to add them together. 5 plus 6 is 11, and the answer is negative. So negative 5 plus negative 6 is going to give us negative 11. Then for the next one, we have positive 14 plus a negative 5. So we are taking a positive and we are adding a negative. So the rule is to subtract them as if they were both positive. So 14 minus 5 is 9. The answer is going to take the sign of the number that is further away from 0. So picture positive 14 on the number line and picture negative 5 on a number line. Which of those is further away from 0? Well, 14 is going to be further away from 0, and since 14 is positive, the answer is going to be a positive 9. So what we're going to do is we're going to add each of these that we already did with the number line, and we're going to use the rules for adding and subtracting signed numbers. Now remember, when you have more than two numbers being added, you're just going to add them in the order they appear when you read them from left to right. So starting with negative 1 plus 2, we have a negative plus a positive. So the rule is we're going to subtract them as if they were both positive. So 2 minus 1 is 1. The final answer is going to take the sign of the number that is further away from 0. So picture negative 1 on the number line and picture positive 2 on the number line. Which of those is further away from 0? Positive 2 is further away from 0, and since it's positive, the answer is going to be positive 1. So then for the next one, we're going to take negative 3 and we're going to add negative 2. So a negative plus a negative is a negative. 3 plus 2 is 5. So you get negative 5. Then for the last one, we're going to add this in stages. So I'm going to do 3 plus negative 1 first. So we have a positive 3 plus a negative 1. So we have a positive plus a negative. The rule is to subtract them as if they were both positive. So 3 minus 1 is 2. And then the answer is going to take the sign of the number that is further away from 0. So picture positive 3 on the number line and picture negative 1 on the number line. Which of those is further away from 0? Well, positive 3 is further away from 0, and since it's positive, the answer is going to be a positive 2. And then we're going to add 2, so positive 2 plus positive 2 is positive 4. Now, for subtracting signed numbers has its own set of rules or guidelines. So, if you had noticed over here with 14 plus negative 5, 14 plus negative 5 came out to the exact same thing as 14 minus 5, and that is not an accident. That is because adding a negative is the same as subtracting. So if you're taking 2 plus negative 3, that is going to be the same as 2 minus 3, which equals negative 1. And this rule can also go in reverse. Subtracting is the same as adding a negative. So for example, if you have negative 1 minus 3, you can take that subtraction and you can turn it into adding a negative. And then a negative 1 plus a negative 3 will give you a negative 4. So this rule can go in reverse. Adding a negative is the same as subtracting, and subtracting is the same as adding a negative. So that is going to be for the second one, and they're really the same rule. I kind of separated them to make things easier. This is especially handy when you are taking a negative and you are subtracting a positive. So for example, if you have negative 10 minus 2, that is going to be the same as negative 10 plus negative 2, which gives you negative 12. Now, two negatives make a positive, so if you are subtracting a negative number, that is the same as addition. So for example, if you take 2 minus negative 4, you can take that minus negative and turn them into addition and turn this into 2 plus 4, which gives you 6. So what we're going to do is we are going to evaluate each of these without a calculator. So if you want to try these on your own before I go over them, just feel free to pause the video and then resume when you're done working so that you can check your answer. So taking the first one, we have negative 2 minus negative 4. So the first thing I notice is that we are subtracting a negative. Subtracting a negative is the same as adding. So I'm going to take this minus minus and turn it into plus. So that turns this into negative 2 plus 4. Now this is adding signed numbers, so I have a negative number plus a positive number. The rule is to subtract them as if they were both negative. Sorry, as if they were both positive, excuse me. So subtract them as if they were both positive. And then the sign of the final answer is going to take the sign of the number that is further away from 0. So picture negative 2 on the number line, and then picture positive 4 on the number line. Which of those is further away from 0? So since positive 4 is further away from 0, the final answer is going to be positive 2. So then for the next one, 3 minus negative 9, if you have subtracting a negative, that is the same as adding. So I'm going to take this subtracting a negative and I'm going to change it into addition, and 3 plus 9 gives you 12. So then for the next one, you can do this in one of two ways. You can either think of this as 9 plus negative 7, or you can remember that adding a negative is the same as subtracting. So you can also think of this as 9 minus 7, which gives you positive 2. So then for the next one, for 5 minus 6, you can do one of two things. This is pretty easy to do in your head, but you can also remember that subtracting is the same as adding a negative. That rule that I just used for the last one does go in reverse. So you can take this subtraction and turn it into adding a negative. And then it is going to follow the same rules as adding signed numbers. So we have a positive 5 plus a negative 6. The rule is to subtract them as if they were both positive. 6 minus 5 is 1. And then the final answer will take the sign of the number that's further away from 0. So picture positive 5 on the number line and picture negative 6 on the number line. Which of those is further away from 0? Since negative 6 is further away from 0, the answer is going to be negative 1. The answer takes the sign of the number that's further away from 0. So then for this next one, we have positive 10 minus 18. So again, you can think of this subtraction as adding a negative. And you can think of this as positive 10. I'm sorry, my stylus glitches and I don't know why it does that, and nothing I've done seems to fix it. So sorry about that. Let's try that again. So this can be rewritten as positive 10 plus negative 18. So I have a positive plus a negative. The rule is to subtract them as if they were both positive. So 18 minus 10 is 8. The sign of the final answer is going to take the sign of the number that is further away from 0. So picture 10 on the number line and picture negative 18 on the number line. Which of those is further away from 0? Since negative 18 is further away from 0, the final answer is going to be negative 8. And then for the last one, this last one is kind of dipping into a topic that we're going to cover more extensively later called order of operations, which I'm sure that you've probably done order of operations in previous courses or sometime in your math past, and you might remember what always comes first in order of operations: parentheses. Now, brackets are basically the same as parentheses. So I'm going to do what's in these brackets first, and then I'm going to deal with that 4 minus in a little bit. So dealing with what's in these brackets first, I notice that there is a minus minus in here. There is subtracting a negative. Subtracting a negative is the same as addition. So I'm going to take this minus minus and turn it into plus. So then 2 plus 3 gives you 5. Then we're going to, now that the parentheses are taken care of, now I'm going to tackle that 4 minus that was outside of the parentheses. So remember, subtraction is the same as adding a negative. So you can think of this as 4 plus negative 5. If we have a positive plus a negative, the rule is to subtract them as if they were both positive. And the sign of the number, the sign of the final answer is going to take the sign of the number that is further away from 0. So which of these is further away from 0, positive 4 or negative 5? Negative 5 is further away from 0, so the answer is going to be a negative 1. Now for each of these, now that we've done a whole bunch of examples, I do want you guys to try each of these. I want you to evaluate each of these without a calculator. So go ahead and pause the video and then resume when you are done working and ready to check your answer. Okay, so for the first one, if we are subtracting a negative, that is the same as addition. So 5 minus negative 2, I'm going to change that minus minus into a plus. That turns it into 5 plus 2, which is 7. Now for the next one, remember that subtracting is the same as adding a negative. So if you have a negative number minus a positive number, you can change that subtraction into adding a negative. So I'm going to change this into negative 16 plus negative 20. And remember, a negative plus a negative is a negative. 16 plus 20 is 36. So the answer is going to be negative 36. Same thing for this next one. If you have negative 10 minus 4, you can always turn subtraction into adding a negative. So I'm going to turn that into adding a negative 4. So that turns this into negative 10 plus negative 4. And then a negative plus a negative is a negative. 10 plus 4 is 14. Then for the next one, negative 15 plus 3, we have a negative number plus a positive number. So the rule is to subtract them as if they were both positive. 15 minus 3 is 12. And then the sign of the final answer is going to take the sign of the number that is further away from 0. So which of these is further away from 0, negative 15 or positive 3? Since negative 15 is further away from 0, the answer is going to be negative 12. And then for the last one, for 5 minus 40, you can change that subtraction into adding a negative. So you can turn this into 5 plus negative 40. And then we have a positive number plus a negative number. The rule is to subtract them as if they were both positive. 40 minus 5 is 35. The answer is going to take the sign of the number that's further away from 0. So on a number line, which of these is further away from 0, negative 40 or positive 5? Since negative 40 is further away from 0, the answer is going to be negative 35. So that is the rules for adding and subtracting any signed numbers. And though we worked with pretty much whole numbers for the first part of this video, I will say that you can use those same rules when you are adding and subtracting positive and negative fractions. So all of those same rules for positives and negatives are going to apply to fractions. And yes, as we covered in the last video, fractions can be negative. Now, just a recap of fractions, a fraction is a part of the whole. So fractions are generated when you divide two whole numbers. So there is a whole number on the top of the fraction, and the top number is called the numerator, and the numerator stands for the number of parts that the fraction contains. And then on the bottom is another whole number called the denominator. The denominator is the total or the whole that is being divided. Now, when the numerator is larger than the denominator, it is called an improper fraction. Improper fractions are completely okay in this class. We are not going to be converting improper fractions into whole numbers. Sorry, into mixed numbers. So stay away from mixed numbers. So a whole number paired with a fraction is a mixed number. We're going to stay away from this, and we are going to turn any mixed numbers that we see always into improper fractions, and we're going to work with improper fractions always. We're not going to work with mixed numbers at all. Now, just to get this out of the way, you're going to see why this rule works when we get to dividing negative numbers, but when you have a fraction that is negative, as long as there is a negative in the fraction somewhere, the entire fraction counts as negative. So it really doesn't matter where the negative is in the fraction. If it appears somewhere, the whole fraction is considered negative. So most of the time in typeface, the negative sign is right here in the middle of the fraction bar. However, you could put the negative sign in the numerator and you're not going to change anything. Technically, you could put the negative sign in the denominator, but I would stay away from this because common denominators are going to be a reality, and the last thing that you need to worry about when you're worrying about common denominators is negatives. So I would either recommend putting the negative sign either in the middle or on the top. And in fact, when we get into adding and subtracting fractions, and if some of the fractions are negative, I would highly recommend putting the negative in the numerator. So when you are adding or subtracting rational numbers, also known as fractions, you need the lowest common denominator. You have to use the lowest common denominator. We're going to use LCD for short. So the rules for adding and subtracting positive and negative numbers is going to apply to fractions. Just when you add and subtract fractions, you must have a common denominator. Now, you also need to remember to make sure that your final answer is always reduced or written in lowest terms. So we're just going to cover how to do that really quick because your answer always needs to be fully reduced. So we're going to cover that and then we're going to go back to adding and subtracting. So when you're reducing a fraction, a factor is a number that divides into another number. So for example, 3 is a factor of 6 because 3 goes into 6. 3 times 2 is 6. Now, if you have two numbers that are divisible by the same thing, that is called a common factor. So a fraction is considered fully reduced when the numerator and denominator have no common factors other than 1. So if the numerator and the denominator are both divisible by the same number other than 1, they have a common factor and you can reduce it further. So to reduce a fraction, what you're going to do is you're going to divide both the top and the bottom by that common factor. And if the numerator and denominator have more than one common factor, you're going to divide them both by the greatest common factor, or the largest number that goes into both of them. So we're going to reduce each of these fractions. So the key is to remember that you're looking for the largest number that goes into both the numerator and denominator. So one one place to start if you have no idea where to start. If both the numerator and the denominator are both even numbers, they're at least both divisible by 2. So for 18 over 30, if you have no idea where to begin, you can at least start with 2. However, there is a larger number that goes into both 18 and 30. It is 6. So since both 18 and 30 are divisible by 6, I'm going to take both the top number and the bottom number, and I'm going to divide them both by 6. With fractions, whatever you do to one part of a fraction, you must do the exact same thing to the other. So if you're going to divide the numerator by 6, you need to also divide the denominator by 6. So you need to do the exact same thing to both the top and the bottom of a fraction in order to keep the fraction balanced. So then 18 divided by 6 is going to give you 3. And then 30 divided by 6 is going to give you 5. So just double check, do 3 and 5 have any common factors other than 1? No, they're both prime numbers, so 3 over 5 is your final answer. So what I want you guys to do for the next two is I want you guys to identify the greatest common factor between the numerator and denominator and reduce each of those fractions, and then so pause the video and then resume when you are done working. Okay, so for 3 over 15, both the numerator and the denominator are divisible by 3. So there is a common factor of 3 between these two. So I'm going to take 3 and I'm going to divide it by 3. Whatever you do to the top, you have to do the exact same thing to the bottom. So then 3 divided by 3, any number divided by itself is 1. Over 15 divided by 3 is 5. And since 1 and 5 have no common factors other than 1, that is fully reduced, and that would be your final answer. And then for this last one, for 14 over 21, what number goes into both 14 and 21? Well, they are both divisible by 7. So since there is a common factor of 7, I'm going to divide both the top and the bottom by 7. So 14 divided by 7 is 2. 21 divided by 7 is 3. And since 2 and 3 have no common factors other than 1, this is considered fully reduced, and this would be your final answer. So that is how your final answer should always appear. Your final answer should always be fully reduced or in lowest terms. Now, going back to adding and subtracting rational numbers, in order to add or subtract fractions, you must have a common denominator. Now, not all common denominators are created equal. Don't just multiply the denominators. Sometimes the common denominator is found by just multiplying them, but not always. The lowest common denominator between two fractions is the least common multiple between the two denominators. Now, factors and multiples are different. A factor is a number that goes into another number. A multiple is generated when you take a number and you multiply it by another number. So for example, the multiples of 3 are 3. 3 times 2 is 6. 3 times 3 is 9. 3 times 4 is 12. 3 times 5 is 15. And you get the idea. So 6, 9, 12, 15 are all multiples of 3. So what you're doing when you're finding the lowest common denominator is you are finding the smallest number that is a multiple of both denominators. Now, when one of the denominators is a multiple of the other, so when one number is simply a multiple of the other, then the least common multiple is the larger of the two numbers. So for example, if your denominators were 3 and 6, if one of them was 3 and one of them was 6, since 6 is a multiple of 3, since one number is a multiple of the other, the least common multiple would be the larger of the two. So the least common multiple between 3 and 6 would be 6. Now another special case is when the two numbers have no common factors other than 1. So if the two numbers have no common factors other than 1, then the least common multiple is the product of the two numbers. So for example, let's say that one of your denominators was 5 and the other denominator was 7. These two numbers have no common factors other than 1, so the least common multiple would simply be their product, which would be 35. So what we're going to do is we're going to work on just expressing these two fractions in terms of their lowest common denominator. And then once we get the hang of that, then we'll move into using the lowest common denominator for adding and subtracting. So taking a look at 3/4 and 1/6, I'm going to pay attention to the two denominators, 4 and 6. And I'm going to find the least common multiple between 4 and 6. So I'm going to start by listing out the multiples of 4. So 4 times 1 is 4, 4 times 2 is 8, 4 times 3 is 12, 4 times 4 is 16, 4 times 5 is 20, 4 times 6 is 24, and I think that's probably good. And then I'm going to list out the multiples of 6. So 6 times 1 is 6, 6 times 2 is 12, 6 times 3 is 18, 6 times 4 is 24. So yes, 24 is a common multiple, but it is not the lowest common multiple. And we are always looking for the lowest common denominator, which is the least common multiple between the two denominators. So while 24 is a common denominator, it is not the lowest common denominator. What is a smaller number that is a multiple of both 4 and 6? 12. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remember that the least common multiple was 12. So the lowest common denominator is going to end up being 12. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn each denominator into 12 using multiplication. The thing is, whatever you do to the bottom of a fraction, you must do the exact same thing to the top. So if you're going to multiply the denominator by something, you need to multiply by the numerator by that exact same number. So taking 3/4 to start, I'm going to turn 4 into 12 using multiplication. So what do I multiply 4 by to turn it into 12? Well, you multiply 4 by 3 to turn it into 12. So I'm going to multiply this 4 by 3. And then whatever you do to the bottom, you need to do the exact same thing to the top. So I'm going to multiply this 3 also by 3. Then I'm going to take 1/6 and I'm basically going to do the same thing. So I'm going to turn 6 into 12 using multiplication. So what do I multiply 6 by to turn it into 12? I multiply it by 2. Whatever you do to the bottom, you need to do the exact same thing to the top. So I'm going to multiply the top by 2. And then let's just do the multiplying. 3 times 3 is 9, 4 times 3 is 12. So the first fraction turns into a 9/12. And then 1 times 2 is 2, and then 6 times 2 is 12, so the second fraction turned into 2/12. So expressed in terms of the lowest common denominator, they turned into 9/12 and 2/12. And then once you have them in terms of the lowest common denominator, you can then add and subtract them, which we're going to get to in a little bit. So then for the next one, we have 1/2 and 1/3. So let's pay attention to the two denominators, 2 and 3. Now, 4 and 6 had a common factor. They had a common factor of 2, which was why the lowest common denominator was not just 24, because you had that common factor of 2 between 4 and 6. Is that going to happen with 2 and 3? Do 2 and 3 have any common factors other than 1? They don't. So because 2 and 3 have no common factors other than 1, the least common multiple is going to be their product. So the lowest common denominator is going to be 6. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take each of these two fractions and I'm going to turn their denominators into 6 using multiplication, just keeping in mind that whatever you do to the bottom, you need to do to the top. So turning 1/2 into 6, I'm going to multiply 2 by 3 to turn it into 6. Whatever you do to the bottom, you need to do the exact same thing to the top. Then I'm going to turn 3 into 6 by multiplying it by 2. Whatever you do to the bottom, you need to do the exact same thing to the top. So this first fraction will turn into 3/6, and the second fraction will turn into 2/6. And then for the last one, let's take a look at the two denominators, 5 and 10. So first thing that we should ask is, do these two denominators have a common factor? Yes, they have a common factor of 5. But let's take a closer look. Is one of the denominators a multiple of another? Yes, 10 is a multiple of 5 because 5 goes into 10. So, because one denominator is a multiple of the other, the lowest common denominator is simply going to be the larger of the two. So the lowest common denominator is going to end up being 10. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take each of these two fractions and I'm going to turn them into a fraction with 10 in the denominator. So let's take 1 over 5. What number do you multiply 5 by to turn it into 10? Well, you would multiply 5 by 2. Whatever you do to the bottom of a fraction, you need to do the exact same thing to the top. And do we need to multiply the second fraction by anything in order to get the denominator to be 10? And you could multiply the top and bottom by 1, but that's a waste of time. You don't need to even touch the second fraction because the second fraction is already in terms of your lowest common denominator. So all you needed to do was turn the first fraction into 2 over 10, and now, without even touching the second fraction, they both have common denominators. So we're going to use that process of finding lowest common denominators to add and subtract fractions. Remember, before any adding or subtracting happens, they must have a common denominator. So do not simply add and subtract the top and bottom numbers. You will get absolutely 0 points for doing this. Do not just add and subtract the top and bottom numbers. So here is the actual process for adding and subtracting fractions. You must first make the denominators the same. So you're going to figure out what the lowest common denominator is going to be. You should ask yourself, do these two denominators have a common factor? And if they do, is one denominator a multiple of the other? Once you've figured out what the lowest common denominator should be, you're going to multiply both the top and the bottom of either one or both fractions by a number that will make the denominators the same. Then, once you have a common denominator, you're going to carry over that common denominator into your answer. The only thing that you ever add or subtract are the numerators. So this is why I recommended that if one of your fractions is negative, you put the negative with the numerator, because you really don't want to deal with the negative when finding a common denominator, and the only things that get added or subtracted are the numerators. So you're going to add or subtract the numerators, following your rules for adding and subtracting positive and negative numbers if applicable. Then, step number 4 may or may not be necessary. You're just going to make sure that your final answer is reduced to lowest term. So if you need to reduce the fraction, reduce it. If you don't need to, if your answer was already fully reduced, then great, you're done early. But just make sure that your answer is reduced to lowest terms. Now, especially when you're dealing with the adding a positive and a negative number together. Remember, the final answer takes the sign of the number that's further away from 0. So with fractions, this can be a little tricky. So if your two fractions have the same denominator, they're called like fractions. So the whole point of doing all of this is to make the fractions like fractions. If you have like fractions, the fraction with the larger numerator is the larger fraction. So that might help you with the positives and negatives. So what we're going to do is we are going to perform each of these indicated operations. Now for the first two on the top, they already have common denominators because we're just going to focus on the adding and subtracting part. Then after that, we're going to start getting into finding common denominators first and then adding or subtracting them. So for 7 over 12 plus 2 over 12, the denominators are already the same. So they already have a common denominator. So I'm going to carry over that common denominator into my final answer so far. And then I'm going to just add the numerators. So 7 plus 2 is 9. Then before you call it done, you need to make sure that the fraction is reduced to lowest terms. So do 9 and 12 have a common factor? Yes, they're both divisible by 3. So this is not fully reduced. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide both the top and the bottom by 3 to reduce this to lowest term. So 9 divided by 3 is 3. 12 divided by 3 is 4. Now, that since 3 and 4 do not have any common factors other than 1, 3 over 4 is your final answer. Now for the next one, we have negative 12 over 16 minus negative 9 over 16. So since the denominators are already the same, we don't need to worry about common denominators for this one. We're just going to worry about what's going on with the numerators. So the first thing that I notice is that I see a double negative. I see subtracting a negative. Remember, subtracting a negative is the same as addition. So I'm going to turn that into addition. And I'm also going to take this negative that's in front of negative 12 over 16 and I'm going to put it with the numerator. So I'm going to turn this into negative 12 over 16, then plus 9 over 16. Then since the denominators are the same, I'm going to carry over my common denominator into my final answer so far. And I'm just going to add the numerators. So the numerators are now negative 12 plus positive 9. So we're taking a negative plus a positive. The rule is to subtract them as if they were both positive. 12 minus 9 is 3. And then the final answer is going to take the sign of the number that is further away from 0. So which of these is further away from 0, negative 12 or positive 9? Since negative 12 is further away from 0, the answer will be negative 3. So your final answer overall will be negative 3 over 16. Now you can absolutely put the negative with the numerator if you want to, or you could put the negative in the middle. Remember, it really doesn't matter. As long as the negative is in the fraction somewhere, the entire fraction is going to count as negative and you don't have to worry about it. So then for this next one, for this negative 5 over 12 plus 5 over 8, are the denominators the same? They are absolutely not the same. So the denominators are not going to be common for this group. So what we're going to do is I'm going to find the least common multiple between the two denominators. So let's take 12 and 8. Do 12 and 8 have a common factor? Yes, they have a common factor of 4. But since 8 does not go into 12, we're going to have to figure out the least common multiple between 8 and 12. And if you can do this in your head, then all power to you. That's great. But if you can't and you really kind of stuck, just list out a few of the multiples of 8 and 12. And remember, you're looking for the smallest number that is a multiple of both 8 and 12. So 8 times 1 is 8. 8 times 2 is 16. 8 times 3 is 24. That's going to be good enough. And then 12 times 1 is 12. 12 times 2 is 24. And I don't think I need to go any further than that. So the least common multiple between 8 and 12 is 24. So the lowest common denominator is going to be 24. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn each of these denominators into 24 using multiplication. And then whatever you do to the bottom of a fraction, you need to do the exact same thing to the top. So I'm just going to leave that negative alone and I'm going to kind of ignore it for right now. And I'm just going to focus on turning that 12 into a 24. So what do you multiply 12 by to turn it into 24? You multiply it by 2. So then whatever you do to the bottom, you need to do the exact same thing to the top. So I'm going to also multiply the top by 2. So 5 times 2 is 10 and then 12 times 2 is 24. Then I'm going to do the same thing for 5 over 8. So I'm going to multiply 8 by 3 to turn it into 24. Whatever you do to the bottom of a fraction, you need to do the exact same thing to the top. So then 5 times 3 is 15 over 8 times 3 is 24. Now, if you want to, if it makes it easier, you can take that negative and put it with the numerator. So I'm going to turn this into negative 10 over 24 plus 15 over 24. So now that the denominators are the same, now I'm going to carry over my common denominator and I'm going to add the numerators. So I have a negative 10 plus a positive 15. If I have a negative plus a positive, the rule is to subtract them as if they were both positive. 15 minus 10 is 5. The sign of the answer will take the sign of the number that is further away from 0. So on a number line, which of these is further away from 0, negative 10 or positive 15? Since positive 15 is further away from 0, the answer will be positive 5 over 24. And do 5 and 24 have any common factors? They don't. So this is actually fully reduced, and that is actually your final answer. Same thing with 3 over 16. 3 and 16 didn't have any common factors, so that was fully reduced. So then for the next one, we have 1 over 12 minus 1 over 3. So the denominators are not the same, so we're going to have to find the lowest common denominator. So let's take a look at the two denominators, 12 and 3. Do 12 and 3 have a common factor? They do. And even more than that, is one denominator a multiple of another? Is 12 a multiple of 3? And it is. 3 goes into 12, so 12 is a multiple of 3. So when one denominator is a multiple of another, the lowest common denominator is going to be the larger of the two denominators, which is going to be 12. So I don't even need to do anything to the first fraction to turn it into a 12, so I'm just going to leave the first fraction as 1 over 12. Then I'm going to turn 3 into 12 by multiplying it by 4. Whatever you do to the bottom of a fraction, you need to do the exact same thing to the top. So 1 times 4 gives you 4 over 12. And then for this, if you notice, the first number 1 is smaller than the second number 4. So if you can do this in your head, that's great. Another thing that you can do is you can turn that subtraction into adding a negative if you want to. So you can turn this into 1 over 12 plus negative 4 over 12. So since the denominator is common, I'm going to carry over that common denominator into my final answer so far, and I'm just going to add the two numerators. So positive 1 plus negative 4. I have a positive plus a negative. The rule is to subtract them as if they were both positive. 4 minus 1 is 3. And the sign of the final answer is going to take the sign of the number that is further away from 0. So which of these is further away from 0? Positive 1 or negative 4? Since negative 4 is further away from 0, the answer is going to be negative 3 over 12. And then remember, you can put the negative with the numerator, or you can put the negative off to the side. As long as the negative is somewhere, the whole fraction counts as negative. Now, the only thing that you have to worry about is making sure that your answer is reduced to lowest terms. So, is there a number that goes into both 3 and 12? Yes, 3 goes into both 3 and 12. So I'm going to take both the numerator and the denominator, and I'm going to divide them both by 3 to reduce this fraction. And yes, it is still negative. 3 divided by 3 is 1. 12 divided by 3 is 4. So your final answer, your final fully reduced answer, is going to be negative 1 over 4. So then I want you guys to do that same thing for these next two. So keep in mind, don't worry too much about the negatives until you're really done dealing with the common denominator, and then move the negatives into the numerator when you go adding and subtracting them. So I want you guys to use the lowest common denominator to subtract and add each of these fractions, pause the video, and then resume when you are done working. Okay, so for this first one, we have negative 11 over 12 minus 3 over 4. Obviously, the denominators are not the same, so we're going to have to find the lowest common denominator. Also, I don't know what I did. Hold on. There we go. All right, so let's take a look at the two denominators first. We have 12 and 4. Do 12 and 4 have a common factor? They do. Also, is one denominator a multiple of another? Does 4 go into 12? It does. So since 4 goes into 12, that means 12 is a multiple of 4. So you might remember when one denominator is a multiple of the other, the lowest common denominator is going to be the larger of the two. So the lowest common denominator is going to end up being 12. So we don't even need to do anything to the first fraction to turn it into a fraction with a common denominator. The one thing I am going to do, though, is I'm going to move that negative to the numerator, because in a few minutes I'm going to be ready to do the subtraction. So then I'm just going to turn this 4 into 12 by multiplying it by 3. Whatever you do to the bottom, you have to do the exact same thing to the top. So then we have negative 11 over 12 minus 3 times 3 is 9 over 4 times 3 is 12. So now that we have these expressed with a common denominator, now we're just going to worry about subtracting the numerator. So I have a negative 11 minus a positive 9. Remember, subtracting is the same as adding a negative. So I'm going to turn that into negative 11 over 12 plus negative 9 over 12. Then I'm going to carry over my common denominator into my final answer so far. And then I'm going to add the numerator. So negative 11 plus negative 9. A negative plus a negative is a negative. 11 plus 9 is 20. And then remember, you can put the negative with the numerator, or you can put it off to the side. It really doesn't matter. And yes, it is okay for you to leave your answer as an improper fraction. And in fact, we're going to prefer you to leave your answer as an improper fraction. The only thing is that the fraction does need to be fully reduced, and this is not fully reduced. So you're looking for a number that goes into both 20 and 12. They have a couple of different common factors. First of all, they're both even numbers, so if you have no idea where to start, you can at least start by dividing them both by 2. But what is the largest number that goes into both 20 and 12? Well, 4 goes into both 20 and 12. So I'm going to reduce this by dividing both the top and the bottom by 4. Remember, the whole thing is still negative, so I'm going to leave that negative sign out front. 20 divided by 4 is 5, and then 12 divided by 4 is 3. And yes, you can leave your answer as 5 over 3. You can leave it as an improper fraction. In fact, I would prefer if you did. The only thing is, just check, do 5 and 3 have any common factors? No. So now it's fully reduced. So now this is your final answer. So then for the last one, we have negative 5 over 6 plus 3 over 10. Since the denominators are not the same, we need to find common denominators first before we can add these together. And if you take a look at the two denominators, 6 and 10, do 6 and 10 have a common factor? They do. However, 6 does not go into 10, and 10 is not a multiple of 6. So we're just going to have to find the least common multiple between 6 and 10. It is not 60. If you use a common denominator of 60, you're using a common denominator, but not the lowest. So if you use the common denominator of 60, you are not going to get full credit for this question on either any homework problems or any exam problems. So you need to use the lowest common denominator. If you don't know how to, if you don't know where to begin, just start by listing the multiples of 6 and 10. 6 times 1 is 6. 6 times 2 is 12. Sorry about that. 6 times 3 is 18. 6 times 4 is 24. 6 times 5 is 30. 6 times 6 is 36. And then list the multiples of 10. So 10 times 1 is 10. 10 times 2 is 20. 10 times 3 is 30. And I think we found it. So since 30 is the smallest number that is a multiple of both, the least common multiple is 30. So the lowest common denominator is going to be 30. So then I'm going to turn each of these fractions into a fraction with a denominator of 30. I'm just going to leave that negative alone. Just going to leave it off to the side here. I'm going to deal with it later. So I'm going to turn 6 into 30 by multiplying it by 5. Whatever you do to the bottom, you need to do the exact same thing to the top. So 5 times 5 will be 25. Over 6 times 5 is 30. Plus, then I'm going to do the same thing for 3 over 10. I'm going to turn it into a fraction with a denominator of 30. So I'm going to multiply 10 by 3 to turn it into 30. Whatever you do to the bottom, you need to do to the top. So this will turn into 3 times 3 is 9 over 30. So now that both of these fractions have a common denominator, I'm going to then move that negative into the numerator to turn this into negative 25 over 30 plus positive 9 over 30. Then, since you went to all that trouble of finding the common denominator, you need to carry it over into your final answer so far. And then I'm going to add the numerators. So I have negative 25 plus positive 9. So I have a negative plus a positive the rule is going to be you subtract them as if they were both positive. So 25 minus 9 is 16. And then the final answer is going to take the sign of the number that is further away from 0. So on a number line, which of these is further away from 0? Negative 25 or positive 9? Since negative 25 is further away from 0, the answer is going to be negative 16. And then you can also move that negative into, out of the numerator and off to the side here. So you can turn this into negative 16 over 30. Then the only thing that you need to worry about is the fraction reduced, which it is definitely not reduced. So you need to figure out what number goes into both 16 and 30. And if you have no idea where to start, since they're both even numbers, they are both divisible by 2. And in fact, that's the only number that goes into both 16 and 30. So I'm going to divide 16 by 2, and I'm going to divide 30 by 2, just leaving that negative alone. 16 divided by 2 is 8, and then 30 divided by 2 is 15. And since 8 and 15 do not have any common factors other than 1, your final answer is going to be negative 8 over 15. So that is going to be it on adding and subtracting signed numbers, including adding and subtracting positive and negative fractions. Remember, with fractions, you need to use the lowest common denominator. So on any homework or exam questions, if you do not use the lowest common denominator, if you just indiscriminately multiply them, you may not get full credit for that answer. So thank you all very much for watching, and in the next video we're going to be covering multiplying and dividing signed numbers, including multiplying and dividing fractions. So stay tuned for that video. Thank you all very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.